We have lectured through many of the writings of the elite, and today we're going to be talking about Professor Anrtony Sutton. He wrote a trilogy, but the first of that will deal with Wall Street and how Wall Street is a big-time historic funder of revolutions and the revolutionary philosophy. So we're going to be covering Professor Sutton's Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution. And we're covering this because even though it's not technically speaking a writing of the elite as a defense, this is a person from the academic establishment who, the more he studied into the history of economics, became convinced that more was afoot when it comes to the notion of revolutionary philosophy and how it's promulgated, how it gains ground, how it really takes over a country, a nation, a continent, whatever it is, an entire age perhaps. And so Professor Sutton, delving into congressional archives as an archivist, delving into declassified cables back in the 1970s, was able to write this profound and really mind-blowing book, given the fact that this is in the midst of the Cold War, highlighting how there could have never really been a revolution, Marxist socialist revolutions, without large capital behind it. And that capital is not just from the banks on Wall Street, but also from the industrialists on Wall Street, funding both the Axis and Allied power, funding both sides of conflicts, whether right or left. And so this is an amazing and important book, again, written in the midst of the Cold War. And he begins his book with a fascinating cartoon drawn many years ago, back in 1911, by a cartoonist, Robert Minor, for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. And you'll notice in this cartoon, you see the figure of Karl Marx right there. Carl. Not Carl from Walking Dead. Another Walking Dead Karl Marx. They're shaking hands with the elite on Wall Street because money went into the revolutions. And that's a key thing that a lot of times revolutionaries don't ask. Where did the revolution get its funding? Where did they get their weapons of war? Where did they get their guns, their propaganda, their whatever went into the revolutionary front? Who gave them that money? Who's supporting them? Where are they getting the ability to travel around, as some of the revolutionaries traveled in first class back in their day at the turn of the century? Where are they getting the money to go around the world and lecture? And where are they getting the money to go into these other countries and set up shop and really begin the agitprop, theaters that they would do to get the crowds and the masses stoked up? And so we'll be discussing the introduction to this book, as I did this week over at Lord Voldemort's. And then we will cover the full book in lecture series, as we often do here at JaysAnalysis, over on my site and at Rockfin for the subscribers. He talks about the actors on the revolutionary stage at the beginning, which is a perfect sort of title for a chapter, the actors on the stage, because many of the early revolutionaries in this period were in fact agitprop actors. Interesting. And he starts off with a powerful thesis. Monopoly capital has been behind the false left-right dialectic and has funded, from some of the wealthiest people in the Western world have funded both revolutionary leftism and revolutionary right-wing fascism. And he says that this is an alternative conceptual packaging, he says, and this is why it's so hard for people to accept it or understand it. It's because it's so contrary to the built-in duality of the dialectical two-party system, left-right system that they're so used to. But he says that what I'm talking about is something above that, a tier above that, where figures like J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, other interests, banking interests, would put money into efforts and entities that appear, at least on the surface, to be completely antithetical to the interests of big capital, right? Marxism, socialism. And he gives an example that made me think of the way that corporate welfare works, right? Corporations are able to get government subsidies, government bailouts, and that's another form of socialism. And if we can understand that in the modern era, we can begin to understand how, if that's possible, then don't you see that it's possible that in order for consolidation and for the transference of wealth offshore, a powerful, wealthy elite person in another country might fund a revolution in a separate country, because that's a powerful means, an excellent technology actually of warfare to basically mow down the history in that country, start all over, and then when things are being rebuilt, then foreign interests can come in and buy up pennies on the dollar, especially if there's, for example, a boom-bust cycle that's manipulated, as Dr. Quigley talks about in Tragedy and Hope. Then you can bust it, and then with an intentional bust, and then come in and buy it up, pennies on the dollar. And so that's how he begins the book, and he really says, just in the clearest of words, that there would never have been socialist Marxist revolutions without basically billionaires behind it. And again, they knew with really pragmatic certitude and just a really Machiavellian attitude that a lot of these revolutions would fail, but they would have the effect of destroying the economies in those countries, right? Marxism, socialism, Federal Reserve central bank that runs up the debt, inflation, money printing, and so forth. That has the ability to eventually just basically destroy the country. Then it can be bought up because it's a boom-bust cycle that's manipulated by design. And so he gives example of money going to Trotsky, for example. And he talks about Woodrow Wilson being a fan of Trotsky, and people in the Wilson administration, Colonel Edwin Mandell House, who was the agent of the banking elite in England, for example. Colonel House kind of seemed to be a handler character to Woodrow Wilson, and Wilson might have even been blackmailed in an sexual way. Now, the Bolsheviks got support not just from big oil, and he lists different figures who put money into that, figures relating, such as E.H. Doheny, William Boyce Thompson, Thomas Lamont, Charles Crane, all of these together with the banker agent, Colonel Edwin Mandell House, were able to cajole Wilson into giving Trotsky, for example, a passport. It's interesting then that this on-the-run revolutionary who's basically able to live it up and travel, first class, gets a passport from Woodrow Wilson, and that's because he was being supported by people bigger and more powerful than Woodrow Wilson. He makes an interesting analogy to some pre-Bolshevik revolutions that kind of set the stage, and maybe might have been a dry run, he calls it. So he says that, for example, Mexico had their first Soviet-style government from in 1917, and that was a result of Trotsky and money that was put into him trying to fund revolution there. He'll talk about that a little more later, but he says $10,000, for example, came to Trotsky from the German government, and a lot of people were confused by this because they thought that this made Trotsky into a German agent. And you'll sometimes hear this theory that Trotsky was a German agent. The reason for that is because the initial $10,000 that went to Trotsky for his revolutionary purposes came through the German government, but it wasn't the German government. It was actually somebody sending money as a cover through the German government, and he'll talk about that later. But it's important to realize that most likely, as we said, Woodrow Wilson supported him due to probably being blackmailed and thus providing passports that allowed him to travel freely. And this more or less amounted to establishment support in the United States even back then. Again, we said the Crane Company, Charles Crane, Westinghouse Corporation aided Trotsky in these situations. It goes on to talk about Canadian government files that had been declassified about Trotsky, where they caught him and they were like, hey, what about this revolutionary? Oh, let him go, right? So the inner elite establishment, even at that time, let him go. And even the Canadian government, in their intelligence files and analysis, thought that he was an agent of Germany because this money had come from Germany. But of course, they didn't know that the money came to the German government from a banker in Sweden named, I think, Olaf, who we'll get to here in a minute. Another important character, Dr. Coulter, made important interventions for Trotsky to make sure that he was never arrested or apprehended, and thus Canada let Trotsky go. He was a Bolshevik and a inside player. There was also money that came apparently from New York and banks in New York that aided, in, particularly in this case, Trotsky. And then Dr. Sutton goes into discussing declassified documents. So this is something that's verifiable. It's not something that's a theory. And again, this is somebody who was a very mainline academic studying history of economics and U.S. history and revolutions who figures this out through these archives, that this was really being played at a higher level. And that's something that we've talked about so much. And it really reflects, again, attitudes that we've seen in figures like David Rockefeller, for example, who wrote New York Times editorials that you can look up from a China traveler, where he says that he's really a huge fan of Mao and the social experiment in China, and how it has the ability to collectivize, and it's really an amazing control structure, he says. In fact, that's why in his memoirs he talks about going to China and setting up Chase Bank in communist China as kind of the one allowed bank at that time. I think in the 70s is when he talks about it. He actually went before Nixon went to China. Money also came from Kiev to Trotsky, he says. And this is part of, according to Sutton, perhaps why Stalin went after Trotsky, because Stalin might have gotten wind of some of this and believed that Trotsky was an agent of big capital. And so that's perhaps part of the reason why there was the fallout and the opposition between Stalin and Trotsky. Next, we have the character of Vladimir Lenin, probably the most famous of these Russian revolutionaries in the early stages. And he also got money from banks that were housed in Germany. He also got money from the American International Corporation, which was a J.P. Morgan institution. He was supported by Max Warburg, and also was aided by Colonel Edwin Mandell House as the handler to Woodrow Wilson. So again, remember that J.P. Morgan interests had as one of their outfits the American International Corporation, and they really pressed the government, Woodrow Wilson and others, to recognize Lenin and Trotsky as legitimate political figures in their revolution. And so another interesting point that comes up, which a lot of people don't know about, is that another means by which money was trafficked, you could say, or laundered to the revolutionaries was through the Red Cross. So even at this time, even this early, back in the 19-teens, the American Red Cross mission, he says, negotiated the payment of $2 million from Wall Street interests with the aid of Woodrow Wilson to revolutionaries. That's $2 million in 19-teens money. So, and you say, well, but why would they do that? Why would they do that? Well, Dr. Sutton accurately explains here on page 47 that that's because they saw the potential of Russia as a huge future market. So they just wanted to put up shop and get after these resources and these markets in Russia. And so in a very cold, calculated Patrick Bateman kind of way, they're more than happy to fund the revolution that would collapse this country so that their corporations can expand into these countries. He goes on to talk about other interests. Kuhn and Loeb, allied with the American International Corporation, J.P. Morgan, and Rockefeller interests had by this time had tremendous amount of power and influence in the United States. We've covered that in many of our lectures. And he talks about how other examples of funding a revolution through really powerful corporate interests, such as Sullivan and Cromwell being involved in the overthrow and revolution that occurred in the Panama Canal. He talks about money from corporations going to Sun Yat-sen through secret societies to fund those events in China. And then he also mentions that the OSS was involved in training Mao's guerrillas, which is something I've talked about as well for many years. And he mentions the figure of Charles Hill as a key player there. Sun Yat-sen in 1912, another example of this. And then he returns to the dry run, The Texas Revolution, he says, was a dry run for the Bolshevik Revolution. And so Pancho Villa and what's known as the Carranza Revolution was a pre-Bolshevik style dry run that had a lot of parallels. And this leads to, I can't read my note there. Somebody, basically a new government in Mexico. As I said, the Carranza government in Mexico. And so at the same time, there were also banks that played a key role, for example, in before the revolution, granting big loans to Russia as a nation, to the Tsar. One of those was the National City Bank. And this bank was run by the character named Olaf Ashberg. And Olaf Ashberg was a key player in sending the money through these different fronts and covers. And together with J.P. Morgan, Rockefeller, and Cecil Rhodes' interests, Olaf kind of had his own network known as the Bolshevik banker of others in the banking industry that he worked with who were famous socialists. So he seemed to have this bank of socialists, right? So he talks about, Dr. Sutton says that other famous operatives there at the bank, G.W. Dahl, K.G. Rosling, C. Gerhard Magnusson, all played a role in helping to promote socialism via big bank money. And the loans to the Tsar then had the effect of really getting, mounting up big, piles of debt, so that when the revolution happens and then everything, the country's bankrupted, not only is the country basically raised, you also then have a massive debt that has to be paid to these foreign banks and foreign lenders. Then what happens is, as planned after the revolution and after the change in the landscape of the country, then the foreign banks, in this case UK banks, come in, buy up the loans, or they buy up Russia after the collapse. And so that's a good introduction. We'll start with that as the opening salvo for Wall Street and the revolutions. But he goes on to talk about in the other chapters how it doesn't just stop in Russia. World revolution is something that the elite really wanted to push. We're seeing that now. That's what we kind of live through today. The latest instantiations of this same world revolution is not something new, and that's something else that we've hammered a lot here in our Global Elite series. He goes into chapters specifying in what ways and how the Red Cross was used as a front for this intelligence operation, for this covert operation, basically to launder money. He goes into chapters on exporting the revolution, where revolutionaries fled in other countries. He talks about the guarantee trust moving into Russia after the revolution, which is a key thing that was the long-term goal here, right? He talks about J.P. Morgan, again, giving big help to the revolutionaries, and this curious alliance of the elite and the revolutionaries. So all of that is covered in a lot of detail in this classic text. Again, it's not a conspiracy text. It's actually an academic text from a famous economist. And I want to remind you, too, that if you like what you see here at my channel, go ahead and subscribe to get the full lecture, which we'll do in the next few days at my site for subscribers and also on my Rockfin channel. And also, if you want to de-soy yourself, right? Don't destroy yourself. De-soy yourself. Become toxically masculine by heading over to the show sponsor, choq.com. That's CHOQ.com. For the best supplements out there. I recommend the Daily if you want to get started in overall supplementation to add to your nutrient deficient diet. We all have a nutrient deficient diet in the modern era. If you're looking for just an energy boost, I recommend Action 2.0 for your exercise regimen or hitting up the gym. If you're looking for mental clarity and focus, I have a big recommendation from Jamie for the She Legit, because she takes that every day. She's been reading like a madwoman lately, going through many, many books. If you're looking for something a little more hardcore, you could go for the Tongkat Ali, which is proven peer-reviewed studies to boost testosterone. And so you can use the promo code J50 to get 50% off any of those excellent supplements. If you want to set up recurring subscriptions so that you don't have to keep putting that information in there every week, use the promo code J53LIFE. That's J53LIFE. Be sure and hit like and subscribe, and be ready for part 2 because we're going to go really deep on this one.